Vienna Seminar. I'm Benedict Henselik from the Austrian National Defense Academy, one of the co-hosting institutions. We are glad that so many of you followed our invitation this morning. Let me start with a short but important announcement. The first morning session until the next coffee break will be live streamed. That's the reason also for the cameras and all the technical equipment you see around here. After the morning coffee break, sessions 2 to 4 will then be chat-and-house sessions. For 48 years, the International Peace Institute as well as the Austrian Foreign and Defense Ministers have jointly conducted this seminar. To underline the importance of this cooperation, the Director General of Operations at the Austrian Ministry of Defense and Acting Chief of Defense Staff of the Austrian Armed Forces, Lieutenant General Karl Schmidt joined us today. General, may I ask you for your words of order?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests. Director of Operations always has to expect the unexpected. And the unexpected happened last night. I was informed that the Minister of Defense cannot be with us today due to other important commitments. It's up to me to extend his greetings and thanks for your dedicated work in the important area of United Nations peacekeeping. We'll make sure that our minister's speech will be part of the seminar documentation, also in written form. What I can do is to offer you three options. Firstly, to read the minister's speech. Secondly, to quote several chapters and refer to the speech. Or thirdly, to more or less speak off the cuff and tell you from an operations officer's perspective from a small country in Central Europe how the Austrian Armed Forces are running our international engagements and domestic operations. Can I take it that you are interested in a mix of my personal experiences and my personal perspectives, which are in line with the key messages of our minister's speech? And as I underlined, the minister's speech is available for you in a written form and part of the seminar documentation. Can I take it that you are in favor of the third option, if this is the case? Let's try to get my key messages across. The Austrian forces do have limited resources. We do have a modest budget. However, we are heavily engaged in multinational and national operations. I'm going to distinguish between four types of operations. Firstly, international operations. Secondly, contributions to multinational reserves and formations. Thirdly, security assistance operations in Austria for the Ministry of the Interior. And fourthly, contributions to high-risk events. And one of these high-risk events is taking place today because the city center of Vienna is going to be completely blocked because we are expecting a high-ranking visitor, the president of the Russian Federation here in Austria. Let's start with ongoing international operations. Approximately 900 Austrian soldiers are employed in international missions. The majority of them is engaged in the Western Balkans. And as far as UN mandated and UN conducted operation is concerned, a company-sized unit is engaged in UNIFIL under command of Major General Beery. And thank you for your support for all our needs down there in Lebanon. The legal basis for our international engagement is a governmental decision, a Ministers' Council resolution. And secondly, this governmental resolution has to be approved by the main committee of our National Council, our parliament. So this is the basis for the deployment of Austrian troops in international operations. Bosnia, Kosovo, and Lebanon do have, our engagement in Bosnia, and Kosovo, and Lebanon do have a significant political and public support. Also, a support from the Austrian media. This is not necessarily the case when it comes to other engagements, since the Afghan ambassador is here and present. I can tell you that we do have controversial discussions, and we have had controversial discussions when it comes to our engagement in ISAF, when it comes to our engagement in RSM, when it comes to our engagement, let's say, in the eastern part of the Ukraine, when it comes to our engagement in Africa. So it's up to us, the military leaders and our political masters, to convince the parliament that it is necessary within our limited resources to provide an adequate contribution to international crisis management in the spirit of solidarity and multinational burden sharing. This brings me to the second category, contributions to multinational reserves and formations. They are less visible. They do cost resources, but they are of utmost importance for the further improvement of our military capabilities. At the current stage, we are providing 900 troops for multinational reserves and formation. Basically, they are stationed in Austria, but kept on a short notice to move. So we are leading the operational reserve forces for the NATO operation in Kosovo at the current stage until the end of June, with Germany as our junior partner. Austria is in lead and Germany is our junior partner. Can you imagine that? We are talking about a NATO operation. Austria is a non-NATO country. We are just a NATO partner, but they rely on us. They rely on us. They know that we are a reliable troop contributing nation, and we have to provide the reserve forces battalion. This Germany is our junior partner. The second engagement, and since there are several Dutch representatives here this morning, we are participating in the Dutch-led EU battle group at the current stage with mechanized infantry, with an army aviation detachment, with military police, and we can benefit a lot from the experience from our Dutch colleagues. And thirdly, we are providing an intermediate reserve company for our operation in Kosovo. All in all, 900 troops. The third category are security assistance operations. And it always depends on the legal basis how the armed forces can be employed in domestic operations. In our case, it's quite easy. The Minister of Interior requests assistance from the army, and we have to provide the assets and capabilities which are needed. So at the current stage, 800 soldiers are employed along the eastern and southern border in order to assist the police. The main goal is to avoid illegal migration, and additionally 100 soldiers are guarding foreign embassies in Vienna and also selected cultural institutions, in particular Jewish institutions. And the fourth category are contributions to high-risk events. As I pointed out, today is such a high-risk event. We are running an airspace surveillance operation with 800 soldiers of our Air Force. We are establishing a temporary restricted area and a no-fly zone in close cooperation with the police. And when it comes to our EU presidency, because I need hardly remind you that Austria is taking over the EU presidency by the 1st of July, we are also preparing, we call it 12 hours package, with specific assets and capabilities, special reconnaissance, explosive ordnance disposal elements, NBC defense elements, military police elements, helicopters. And we are also providing drivers. As a matter of fact, the drivers for the international delegations qualified non-commissioned officers who are moving the fleet, because the events are taking place not only in Vienna. Austria is such a big country that we can afford to organize high-ranking meetings also in Innsbruck, in Salzburg, in Graz, in Upper Austria. So we are kept quite busy during the second half of 2018. My worst-case scenario, ladies and gentlemen, is not a direct attack. My worst-case scenario are UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, possibly including a small parcel, a gift. And the gift is a dirty bomb. And we do have capability gaps. And we are not the only ones who have capability gaps. And this brings me to UN peacekeeping again. So I think that the characteristics of United Nations peacekeeping are changing dramatically, possibly dramatically. And we have to focus on cyber defense, we have to focus on countering IEDs, we have to focus on electronic warfare, and we have to focus on UAV defense. Besides the traditional tasks of our troops. So, in a nutshell, it's still very important to have military observers standing on top of a hill, observing, making supports. This is perfectly fine. But I think we should take into our considerations modern types of aggression and our correct answers. And this brings me back to UAV defense, cyber defense, countering IED, and it's not only about defeat the device, it's also about attacking the network. Attack the network physically or by going into the net, into the internet, into the cables. I think we do not have any alternatives. And this brings me to my conclusion. I would like to stress a very big advantage of the European Union. The European Union is in the position to cover all components of multinational crisis management, diplomatic activities, the military component, the police component, the humanitarian component, the economic component. So the European Union has a future. The European Union has a future as an active crisis manager, in particular under the umbrella of the United Nations. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes my short speech. I wish you a very fruitful and successful day, a seminar here in Austria and Vienna. Thank you very much for being so attentive.
Thank you very much, General. Representing the International Peace Institute, Dr. Adam Lupal, IPI's Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, will introduce this year's seminar topic, European Contributions to UN Peacekeeping Operations, Lessons Learned and the Way Forward. Adam, the floor is yours.
Morning. Thank you, General, for your briefing on Austrian contributions. Quite comprehensive. Thank you. I also am standing in for my principal. On behalf of IPI President Terry Larson, it is a great pleasure to welcome you all to the 48th annual Vienna Seminar. Terry sends his sincere regrets. As many of you know, he was unable to travel this week. On his behalf, I'd also like to thank our partners, the Austrian Federal Ministry of Defense and the Federal Ministry for Europe, Integration and Foreign Affairs, as well as our host, the National Defense Academy. This is a beautiful space. It's great to see this view from up here. This seminar holds a special place in IPI programming. It goes back to the founding of the Institute and is indeed our longest running project. IPI was founded in 1970 at a time when, because of Cold War politics, it was difficult to speak about peacekeeping through official channels of the United Nations. So the Vienna Seminar was established as an independent forum for the free exchange of views and information to, in part, help train civilian and military peacekeepers. The seminar over the years has covered a variety of topics, both thematic and regional, but UN peacekeeping has always been at the core of its concerns. The 2016 Vienna Seminar looked at the question of how to prepare UN peace operations for a changing world, including how to better integrate conflict prevention, strengthen regional partnerships, and more effectively protect civilians. 2 years on, these questions are even more urgent. Violent conflicts within states have increased since 2010 and are becoming more deadly, particularly for civilians. Armed groups are becoming more fragmented with diverse aims and ideologies, and the increased engagement of non-state actors connected to transnational networks complicates this picture further. Today's civil wars are often internationalized, extending beyond state borders, making them all the more difficult to resolve. It is then in these challenging environments that the majority of peacekeepers are now deployed in the Central African Republic, Darfur, Eastern DRC, Mali, South Sudan. UN missions are deployed in complex, high-risk environments marked by the absence of inclusive peace processes, weak post-government consent, widespread humanitarian and civilian protection needs, and admittedly, concerns about the readiness and performance of UN personnel. What is more, deployed where, as they say, there is no peace to keep, UN peacekeepers are also increasingly themselves under threat and under attack. At the same time, the ability of the UN to leverage all available means in the pursuit of peace is further challenged by well-known divisions in the Security Council, financial constraints, and, let us admit, a wavering commitment to multilateral cooperation by key players. It is in this context that it was decided to revisit the future of UN peacekeeping for this year's Vienna Seminar, with a particular focus on the current and future role of European support to peacekeeping operations. The importance of European contributions to UN peacekeeping, well known to the people in this room, it is already evident in current missions, whether as part of long-standing UN operations like UNIFIL in Lebanon and the more recent ones like MINUSMA in Mali, or in parallel operations by the EU, OSCE, or in national configurations. Indeed, since 2014, we have seen an overall increase in European troops participating in peacekeeping, especially through the contributions of specialized capabilities, from intelligence units, attack helicopters, to medics and strategic lift capacity, all of which have become increasingly vital to effective mandate implementation. One aim, then, of this year's seminar is to better understand the impact of European participation on the effectiveness of UN peacekeeping, and to consider how to further increase and sustain this participation. This discussion comes as the UN Secretary General is seeking to renew international support for UN peacekeeping through the Action for Peacekeeping Initiative, A4P. We can't stay away from the abbreviations at the UN. We have it, A4P. The A4P initiative complements other ongoing efforts to adapt peacekeeping, including to reduce peacekeeper casualties in hostile environments, to ensure mandates realistically reflect conditions on the ground, and broader efforts to reform the UN peace and security architecture, of which peacekeeping is, of course, a part. This is a very big task, and this only begins to cover all of the reform efforts currently underway, and the UN Secretariat is going to need help. During the Security Council's open debate on peacekeeping in March, the Secretary General stated that, quote, action by the Secretariat alone is not enough. to meet the challenges that we face, our chances of success increase dramatically when we work together with member states and share the burdens, risks, and responsibilities. End quote. This year's Vienna Seminar is therefore a timely moment to reflect upon that necessary level of cooperation and on the prospects of sustainable European participation in the current and future UN peace operations in the face of so many challenges. We have a great program ahead today to discuss all of this and more. And we will now turn straight to our first panel. The strategic context for UN peacekeeping and recent European engagement. And with that, I'd like to invite our speakers to the floor. Thank you. So this first session aims to provide a frame for discussion for the rest of the day. What is the strategic context for UN peacekeeping? What has led European engagement? What has led to recent UN engagement in peacekeeping? What then is the impact of the shifting ground of geopolitics today? Interesting question given today's visit to Vienna. And how does this all fit into attempts by European Union member states to revamp a European defense? We have great panelists to discuss all of this. To my right, we have Koen Davids, Deputy Special Representative, the Secretary General, United Nations Multi-Dimensional Integrated Stabilization Mission in Mali, MINUSMA. We have Manuel Rapnui, Head of the Paris Office and Senior Policy Fellow of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Corin Kitzel, UN Coordinator, Foreign and Commonwealth Office, United Kingdom. And Richard Gowan, Senior Policy Fellow, European Council on Foreign Relations. This is not meant to be a ECFR panel, but we're happy to have them here. With that, we'll go straight to Cohen, and then hopefully we should have plenty of time for Q&A from the
Thank you very much, Adam. Thank you for coming, and I would like to thank our hosts first and salute the great contribution of Austria to peacekeeping, which has been very much valued within the UN system and which has been an example for others. The Secretary General was in Bamako last week. We were really happy to host him to celebrate the 29th of May, the Day of UN Peacekeepers. And he showed his solidarity not just with peacekeepers but also with Mali. I think the Malian crisis needs visibility, needs solidarity. So we were very happy to have that visit, and I'll come back to that in a few moments. What I would suggest I do is to very briefly sketch some context on Mali, because not everybody may be familiar with it. Sketch some issues we deal with in peacekeeping, so how the Malian peacekeeping operation relates to the overall peacekeeping discussion. And then last but not least, some short points on where the European contribution has been helpful and what some lessons could be for the European contribution to peacekeeping. And it's clear that Europe has already shown a lot of solidarity with Mali in terms of its contributions. It's multidimensional. Its contributions in terms of the political process, in terms of development assistance, and also in terms of contributions to MINUSMA and to the European missions which help train police and armed forces in Mali. Mali has over 50 troop contributing countries. 40% come out of Africa, and the rest come from all over the world. So it's quite a show of solidarity of the international community with Mali. Of course, that show of solidarity is not just because we want to be nice to Mali. It's also because it's in our interest. I come from the Netherlands. There's only 3 countries between my country and Mali. And so the stability of Mali and the Sahel is crucial for Europe, crucial for North Africa, crucial for the world. Next week, the Secretary General will speak on Mali in the sense that based on his visit, based on what MINUSMA has been doing, the report of the Secretary General will be produced, a quarterly report to the Security Council. And then, of course, the Council itself will speak when it has to renew the mandate of MINUSMA end of June, and there will be debate in the Security Council on the 14th of June. Now, on the context, Mali is twice the size of France, has about 17 million people, ethnically very diverse. The UN is there with a force of about 11,500 troops, about 1,700 police, a couple of hundred civilians. That seems like a lot, but it's a big country, and it's a country which has all sorts of deficits in terms of governance, in terms of security, especially in the outlying regions, so it's a lot to cover. And that's why also this European contribution is so important, specialized contribution. Adam talked about it. The Malian crisis started with a jihadist separatist takeover of the sparsely populated north. It was basically based on the fourth rebellion in the north against neglect of the northern region, a lack of presence by the state. A French intervention followed, an African peacekeeping mission followed by MINUSMA, a peace agreement in 2015, and which was supported by Algeria, and we support its implementation. But elements of crisis continue in the sense that it has taken a long time to bring the peace parties around the table. There's also crisis issues now in the center of the country, which is a different kind of crisis and which is much more fragmented, which the government is trying to deal with and outside partners are trying to help the government. And there's also the fact that Mali has to go through the normal process of a democracy, elections end of July. This weekend there were riots in the streets of Bamako which were related to the elections. So Mali has a lot on its plate. The Secretary General addressed those three pressing issues during his visit. He had a meeting with the peace partners on the peace accord, which was very productive. He went to the central region where also this multinational force, the G5 force, is being made operational with UN support. And he discussed the elections with the government and with the opposition, very much pressing the need for a peaceful process to take place. Now, on the overall peacekeeping challenges, I think as Adam already said, Mali illustrates the point that the blue UN flag does not protect us from attack. We are seen as the precursor of the return of the state, and the return of the state is not in everybody's interest. I think that's the shorthand of it. But I'd like to make a couple of points. First of all, in Mali there is a peace to keep. There is a peace accord. There's a peace accord that actually, with its 4 chapters on security, on political transformation, on justice, on peace dividends, that actually addresses a lot of the concerns that have led to 4 rebellions in the past. The implementation of the peace accord is difficult. You have to build trust. You have to define issues within the peace accord. But I would challenge those who say there's no peace to keep in Mali. The problem is, it's not the only thing going on. In a sense, yes, the majority of the combatants within the conflict of the 2012-2013 conflict are inside that peace agreement, but some are not. And there are other things going on in Mali. Like I said, the situation in the center of the country. The north, which is the basis of the peace accord, has about 10% of Mali's population. The center, where we now have all sorts of tensions going on, has about 30% of Mali's population. So you can see that in spite of the fact that we have a peace accord where now about 50% of its benchmarks are being implemented, we still have other issues to deal with. The second point I'd like to mention is that our political mandate remains key, and that is, yes, we need the troops, yes, we need the region and Mali to build up its security sector to help secure the Malian population. But we also need to keep working on political solutions, on local conflict resolution, on extending the peace process, making the peace camp successful, making the peace camp attractive. We may not be able to lure top terrorists away to the peace camp immediately, but we can prevent mobilization of others by showing that the peace process works. But that brings me to the third point, which is related, and that is MINUSMA does a piece of the peace. There are a lot of other players, and we need to work together. The peace camp is big, the peace camp is diverse, and sometimes that leads to tensions. You have humanitarians who are working who need space to do their own work. You have counterterrorism operations. And we're not the ones doing counterterrorism, we're complementary. We need to make sure that everybody does their piece of the peace, and that in the end we help create space for those who need to do the work. Our support of others in that framework is based on our mandate of human rights and protection of civilians. That is basically what brings this coalition forward and what could help secure a durable peace. The next point is that in this kind of environment, robust peacekeeping is essential. As was said by Adam, the Secretary General commissioned a report by former Force Commander General Dos Santos Cruz, and he initiated this Action for Peacekeeping initiative, and we're very happy with that. because basically it means that we're trying to make our peacekeepers more secure. And if our peacekeepers are more secure, they can help secure the population. They can help do protection of civilians. And that report has led to some discussion. It has led to some discussion, is the UN going to war? And I think, as far as we're concerned, the central message of the report is not an ideology. The central message of the report is a necessity. It's the necessity of preventing further deaths. We have 174 deaths in MINUSMA, 101 directly from attacks. We need to save lives. We can save lives. Troops need to come prepared with the right mindset, with the right training, with the right equipment, and they need to deter, not just for their own sake, but also for the sake of civilians. And that's also why we need situational awareness. We need to know more about where we operate and with whom we're dealing. And those are things where civilian-military cooperation is also key. The next point is that the peace needs to be more inclusive. We see that in the armed forces. The armed forces need to be more diverse. That's not just a nice principle, but it's also something you cannot afford to live without. If you're in a diverse country, your armed forces and your security forces need to be able to deal with a diverse population. But also those without guns, youth, women, both half the population in Mali, they need to be involved, and they haven't been. And that is incredibly important to make the peace more durable and to make the peace more attractive. My final point under this heading is that peace in the Sahel is a national issue, but it's also a regional issue. The Libyan crisis has contributed to the problems we now see in Mali, a history of trafficking, terrorism. That's basically also why the Secretary General is so strong in his support of the regional G5 force initiative, because he feels that's part of the region taking ownership of its own security issue. MINUSMA will not be there forever. We need to transition towards nationally reformed forces, towards regional forces, and taking ownership. And that's where we need to divide the labor among international parties. We need a sign-up sheet basically saying, this is what people do. Richard Cohen, who has written about that recently, that we need more coordination among the peace partners on the security issue. And I could not agree more. My final points are on Europe's contribution. And I think the European contribution has been incredibly relevant for Mali. It's appreciated, it's professional, it's done with respect, it helps with the training effort of armed forces, of police, and Europe was also, the European Union was the first partner to basically discover that we needed to do more in the center in a very multidimensional way, not just security. I think it's also relevant for Europe. As I just said, there is a common interest here, countering trafficking, creating stability for young people, creating hope for the population of Mali, that there's a future actually in their country. I think it's been incredibly relevant for the UN. The EU contribution, the contribution of individual member states has been highly specialized, high quality. It's provided enablers we otherwise wouldn't have. It has addressed capability gaps, and it has led to a better information base of the mission. Some lessons I would draw. First of all, the importance of more than military contributions. One of the reasons why the EU and its member states are so appreciated is because there are political initiatives, there's an envoy, there's work in the political process, because there's a development contribution, and there is this contribution in terms of training and support also for the G5 force, which the EU has strongly supported. The second point is the importance of endurance. Peacekeeping operations, unfortunately, don't stay just for 1 or 2 years. They stay a little longer. So if individual countries cannot provide forces for a long time, it's very important that a group of countries gets together and does some sort of rotation and make sure there's continuity, and that would be incredibly helpful if platforms such as the EU, but also NATO, could be used for that. The third point is that there's now so much experience of Europe coming back to the UN that the culture shock that brings can be prevented. I sometimes wonder for some troop contributors whether the culture shock with coming to the UN is bigger than the culture shock of coming to Mali. And I think sharing some of these experiences can really help, and helping each other in the preparation of contingents can really help to make the transition smoother. The penultimate point is basically the importance of cross-fertilization. We are one mission. We are a civilian military mission. We are a mission with many contingents, but they all work under the blue helmet. They all work under the UN flag. Can we do more to bring contingents together? Can we go on joint patrols? Can basically contingents train each other? We've been looking now, our convoys are being attacked. A lot of TCCs have experience in Afghanistan with doing convoys and in other contexts. So there needs to be more of a view that basically all these troops are in the same boat. It may be a boat in the desert, but let's show that we are together. I think that would be really important. The final point I would like to make is the importance of more women in contingents. MINUSMA has 2% women in the force. That is not enough. We have to walk the talk of our principles. We have to show that we take them seriously ourselves. And by the way, it may have practical consequences. You could end up talking to the other half of the population that you normally ignore. So I think it's incredibly important. European TCCs normally have quite good percentages, national percentages of women in their armed forces. But those percentages do not translate in their contribution to MINUSMA. And I challenge the European TCCs to make up for that deficit and to bring more women to the force. I thank you very much.
All right, thank you. I think there's a tremendous amount on the table already to respond to. Thank you for that update on the context and the state mission in Mali. I think one of the key points for me is that support for Mali is not about not just goodwill, it's in our collective interest, and it's not just it's not a national issue, it's a regional issue. Impact Europe as well. I also think that critical, I made the comment, which is maybe a cliche about no peace to keep, and you pointed out rightly that of course in Mali there is a peace to keep, but not everybody is under that umbrella of peace support, which I think actually makes the point about fragmentation and the challenge of fragmentation, which is not just on the armed actors, but also in the peace camp as well. We can even say challenges of diverse actors even within their mission. We raise the issue of the challenge of bringing people together. So I appreciate that. Lots from you, thank you so much. But we'll turn it to more on the strategic context.
Thank you. Before I came, I asked Richard so that we coordinate a little. And he told me that the only thing I needed to say is that I agreed with everything he said, which I do agree already with everything he will say, but since he hasn't spoken yet, I have to expand a bit on that. So I'll take it from the other side, actually, from the European side. And I think there are plenty of geopolitical shifts that should explain a renewed European interest for defense and security issues. When you work on European security, you have this classical image that what Europe was trying to achieve is to build a ring of friends in its neighborhood, and it ended up with a ring of fire, with a multiplicity of conflicts and crises. But there's a larger evolution to it, which has to do with the nature of the threats, with a clearer sense of the interdependency with regional conflict, and obviously both terrorism and the refugee crisis had a big impact in 2015 in particular, and obviously the evolution of great powers' attitude. And it's not just about threat perceptions, although that does play a role, but it's also about the perception of the international strategic environment. If you look at the French Strategic Review on Defense and National Security, which is a kind of a shortened version of what France's white papers are usually, it's the first time that it brings such a focus on the importance of multilateralism as such. You have this idea that Chancellor Merkel in particular is putting on the table, that Europeans now are in a situation where they need to take their destiny, their security in their own hands and can't rely everything from others. And obviously Brexit also has been a key driver for the renewed impetus of European integration in general, and for efforts to build further European defense in particular. And just to make that clear, the idea would have been to try to move in this direction irrespective of the results of the referendum. It's the process and the general situation in Europe, and Brexit was a kind of a major point in that context, but that would probably have at least been attempted in any case. But I said this should bring more interest for defense. I'm not sure it does fully. From a strategic perspective, actually, Europe has shifted to a much more defensive vision of international security. Precisely, the French strategic review is about defense and national security. You have much less focus, including in France, and I'm not speaking about countries who are less focused on projecting force and stability on the international stage. There's much more focus on national security than on international security or collective security. Territorial defense is back very much in the European discussion on defense. And even when you have military operations abroad, you have biases in them, which are brought by the concerns on terrorism or on migration, and I think Mali and the Sahel in general are a good example of this. And these biases are not neutral. They do have an impact in terms of securitizing political and civilian efforts. In terms of resources also, you have limitation of what Europeans are doing. Obviously, there's a rise in European defense spending, which is a good thing, but there are shortcomings still. Not everyone is on track to reach the famous 2% target. And second, more importantly, as far as I am concerned, the fact that there is more input doesn't mean that there's better output, and it's the output we should be looking at in Europe. There are a number of initiatives which have been taken at the EU level. You may have heard of permanent structured cooperation. I'm not going to bore you to death with what it is and how it works, but I can get to that if you have questions. But there's a broader effort than just permanent structured cooperation, PESCO. There are quite some important things, like the fact that the European Commission is now willing to play an active role on defense issues and put money on the table. But all these efforts mainly focus on capabilities, which is good, but it's only part of the issues. And the decision that the underlying driver of the decisions that were taken on these issues was to favor inclusiveness within the EU of a military ambition to face, as the treaty was saying about permanent structured cooperation, the most demanding situations. On the operational side, ideas to move further are more controversial. You may have heard that France is pushing for what Macron called the European Intervention Initiative. That is still in the pipe and discussed, and it's not as easy to move on that than it was, and it wasn't, on capabilities. So these limitations, you also find them in terms of interest for peacekeeping. I've read very good, excellent articles from people in the room on the so-called European return to peacekeeping, so I'm not going to expand on that. I agree with the idea that the return is mostly limited, that it takes the shape of niche contributions, which is still useful, but that's more or less everything that there is in it. I think it's very striking to see that, for instance, there is no particular appetite by Europeans to contribute to possible peacekeeping operation if ever there was to be one in Ukraine or in Syria, and I'm sure Richard will speak about Ukraine. This so-called renewed European interest has been mostly centered on one key operation, MINUSMA, just as the renewed European interest, which was very much hyped in 2006, ended up mostly limited to UNIFIL at the time. And there are a number of reasons for how it happened and how it went that way, which is coincidence with the fact that some capabilities, some forces were set free by the evolution of the operation in Afghanistan, that you have a gravity effect. You're joining others for a number of reasons, including finding it easier or more comfortable to be with your European partners than with other interlocutors. The fact that you have some sort of reassuring presence with France's Balkans assets, etc., etc. But more deeply than that, I still see when I discuss these issues in the key European countries, that you have the consequences of the 1990s failures still very much there. The number of European military which have been in peacekeeping operations since then, and have seen that things have changed, that UN peacekeeping has changed, the number of these military is not high enough yet to reverse that kind of overall general impression that you find still prevalent in a lot of European military institutions. There's still a big weight of very diverse strategic cultures. It's not just risk aversion and caveats. It's also the fact that you are not so much at ease with non-NATO military environment, and that's the UN environment as such, and also the fact that you are working with non-NATO troop contributing countries. And there is still obviously interest for UN peacekeeping operation as exit strategies for European involvement, which has some upside, such as the impetus in terms of European effort for training and equipment of third country forces, but that's still a very strong bias on how Europeans see peacekeeping. So I don't think that the context is there for a massive European investment in peacekeeping operation, but still there is room for progress, and there are reasons why we should continue to move ahead. One is the notion of solidarity. I think something started, it's not fully happened yet, but something started when, after the November terrorist attacks in Paris, November 2015, the French went to Brussels and called for military solidarity through the one article of the treaty, Article 42.7. And what the French called for at the time was not, we need troops in France to help us. It's, there is this kind of global situation, and we need European contribution to a number of different operations so that we are not overstretched with what we need to do in France and what we are doing abroad. And these European contributions on a number of theaters and under different shapes included, obviously, contributing under the UN flag. And so there is this sense that it wasn't, or it shouldn't be, just solidarity by European partners with French security interests, but it's solidarity because these are common security interests that we have. And peacekeeping, effective peacekeeping, the rationale for UN Blue Helmets deployment in a number of situations are security interests, and there is a sense that we should move in that direction. Another factor is the fact that the EU-UN cooperation has moved, as such, has moved ahead a lot, including on the operational side. And I think, again, I'm very French with this focus on operation. I think this is very important, that you have this kind of European operational cooperation with bridging operations or parallel missions. When I was working on these issues, I always thought, and in the French MFA, I always thought that the focus on security sector reform by the EU was a very good thing, because SSR is a key element of the political strategy to solve the crisis, and also because it's usually a good division of labor between the EU and the UN. It doesn't mean that everything that the EU does on SSR is good, and there's certainly room for progress, but I always wondered why the EU was not trying to invest also on the DDR, which is just as essential in terms of conflict resolution, and often not so well taken care of. And you see in a number of peace-building strategy how DDR is always a trouble maker. There are obviously also lessons, a number of lessons that are learned and will be learned from Mali or Central African Republic, potentially South Sudan too, which may be more useful to the broader peacekeeping policy and to the broader European interest for peacekeeping in general than UNIFIL, because UNIFIL is such a special situation, such a special mission, while clearly Mali and the others are sort of laboratory for the evolution of peacekeeping. We all know that these are the missions that have caused most of the controversies in the UN system and between member states in the recent period. The civilian effort also is something that I think is moving in the right direction. This is the case at the EU level. You may have heard of the Global Civilian Compact, but I must say I'm skeptical on the fact that this will be, as such, a big result if there's no parallel moves at the member state level on those issues. And you can see that there is some move in the right direction also at the member state level, and probably the broader European implication in the Sahel in the wake of their contribution to MINUSMA in Mali, including support to the G5 Sahel, including effort on the development side, including interest for the political dynamic, is something that is very much welcome and should be built upon in a number of other places. Last, obviously this will be good, but it will translate into more and better European implication in UN peacekeeping only if there are efforts and changes also on the UN side. I'm not going to go through the long list because Olga will speak about that, on planning, on mission support, on force protection, all the discussions that we are having now about the use of force, about the importance of the political dimension, etc. But obviously this needs to happen too. If we want that what happens on the European side brings added value to what the UN is trying to do. And I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. Is that yeah? Okay. Great, Manuel. Thank you so much for your comments from the European side, as you say, and why maybe the geopolitical shifts should lead to more interest in multilateral engagement, but it's not necessarily the case that the context is not favorable for a massive investment in re-engagement, but that progress is possible, and something is happening, and in part lessons that we're learning from Mali and CAR lead to that. So thank you for at least some hope there. With that, we'll turn over to Cohen.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So I'm going to try and be a little bit controversial this morning. Starting just on the point about providing an honest assessment of the strategic context for UN peacekeeping for European member states. I mean, of course, it's all about world peace, we know that. As Manuel has already said, there's a wider context there in our near neighbourhood around terrorism and migration. Although I think it's interesting that, similar to the French, and it's clear that great minds think alike between London and Paris, that when we had our Strategic Defence and Security Review in 2015, we came to some similar conclusions about the need to lean into UN peacekeeping. One of the things that happened in London after that was that we created a UN peacekeeping joint unit, which brings together staff from our Foreign Ministry, our Ministry of Defence, and the Department for International Development, who now work in one team based in the Foreign Office in London. So we have a much more joined up approach to the different strands of UN peacekeeping. A couple of other things that were relevant to us in terms of, pure self-interest, and this is relevant to other European countries. Obviously, post-Afghanistan, post-Iraq, UN peacekeeping provides an opportunity to actually go out and do some active operations in hostile environments that we wouldn't necessarily easily have that opportunity to exercise our military capabilities in that way. And once we look beyond the immediate threats of terrorism and migration, we're also thinking in terms of some longer term issues around prosperity. And of course, this is about global economic development and trade and so on. But there are also some really specific things, like if you're looking at the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they have almost all of those minerals that go into our mobile phones. There's some really kind of important little strategic things in there. But on the sort of strategic picture, I wanted to talk a bit about some of the wider threats to the liberal rules-based international system. And I think pretty much every meeting I go to these days with anyone who's outside of the P5, people always ask me about the breakdown in P5 relations in the Security Council. I think it's true that there have been tensions. Obviously, we're not going to deny that, and some things are really difficult. But actually, most of the Security Council's business continues. Most things are still agreed. So business gets done. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the Council has actually always disagreed on war and peace issues. It depends on the issue, and it's kind of gone, it's varied over time. But some of this isn't actually brand new. I think there are some elephants in the room that are worth addressing. We're all aware of, to say the least, the US being more sceptical about multilateralism. I think from a European perspective, there's clearly an element in the sort of narrative around America first, which is the need for greater burden sharing by other UN member states. And clearly our US colleagues are looking to the European member states to pick up more of the burden. We could also talk about an obstructionist Russia, but I don't think we should actually overplay that, because Russia doesn't want to destroy the rules-based international system. Russia's one of the countries that was, part of that founding group. They value their P5 position. And as I say, that despite the difficulties on some portfolios, most Security Council business does still get done. I think actually the more interesting question is about the emergence of China, and that's, to me, more strategic, because I don't think it's temporary. So we can all envisage that the current US opinions on the rules-based international system and multilateralism may well swing back in the other direction under a different US administration. But I think the Chinese are on a very long-term trajectory, because that's the way they think, that's the way that they plan. But I think it's worth noting that that's a threat to the liberal rules-based international system rather than a threat to multilateralism per se. And so we collectively, as European member states, have an important role to play in defending that liberal, democratic, rules-based international system. I think one way to think about it, and I'm stealing this from a Belgian colleague in London, is that the Chinese want to change the software of the rules-based international system, not the hardware. So this is about kind of changing the direction. And of course, it's also part of a wider debate that we're all used to in the Security Council about sort of intervention versus sovereignty. And again, that's not new, but I think there's a long-term trend to be aware of. On some of the specific challenges to contemporary peacekeeping, I'm going to mention 4 things. First is on resources, and that's financial and human and equipment. Now, we have a sometimes tense discussion, I guess, amongst European partners about whether cutting peacekeeping budgets damages peacekeeping or not. I think my starting point would be that if we're really, really honest, UN peacekeeping is massively inefficient. We know that. We know that the UN's management systems and processes and all sorts of things are sort of being dragged, kicking and screaming into the 21st century. And frankly, I think that we see across the UN system, not just in peacekeeping, that unless you have that kind of threat around cutting budget, it's very, very difficult to shift anything and to modernise anything. On the human resources side, I'm sure there'll be lots of discussion today about the questions of forced generation and so on. So I just wanted to comment on a couple of other things. We've already heard the point about gender. From a UK perspective, for us, this isn't about tokenism, it's about genuinely better outcomes on the ground. And we believe that more women in peacekeeping leads to better outcomes, and that's the important thing. Perhaps more controversially, I thought I would mention leadership. And I think in some peacekeeping operations, member states confuse seniority with leadership. And we see examples where senior leaders in the UN system think that their seniority in itself means that they don't need to do any further training. But actually, we see that there are plenty of leaders who don't have the combination of political and managerial skills that are needed to reform peacekeeping and modernize peacekeeping. I know that's quite controversial, but I'm just, as I said, I'm trying to throw out some controversial thoughts here. On attacks against peacekeepers, we've heard obviously also about A4P already this morning. I don't think that's straightforward. There are examples where the UN is essentially deliberately putting itself in harm's way. In many cases, that could actually be a sign that peacekeepers are doing their jobs properly. If they're not putting themselves in harm's way, sometimes, then maybe they're not doing their job properly. There's also, of course, just times when the UN sort of ends up in the wrong place at the wrong time. But what's interesting there is whether the troops have the capabilities to deal with those scenarios, and arguably if they're well trained, well equipped, and well prepared, then they should be able to deal with those scenarios. And then, of course, we get into the question around the UN operating in places where it's seen as being part of the enemy, whatever the enemy is. And I mean, Mali, Somalia, those are examples where the UN's associated with parallel forces engaged in war fighting. So I'm talking about AMISOM, about the G5 Sahel, about the FARDC in DRC. And as we've already heard, a lot of this is a good argument for increased intelligence capability. As we know from our negotiations in New York, that word intelligence in a UN context is absolutely loaded. And we have sort of twisted it around to talk about things like situational awareness, but essentially we mean the same thing. Then I just wanted to touch on the third area of performance in general. I think over recent years we've heard a lot about sexual exploitation and abuse, of course. Now obviously this is an area where European TCCs and PCCs have a really big role to play in terms of role modelling the right kinds of behaviour. Beyond that in performance, for us, a lot of that is actually about really, really basic soldiering. I think that a lot of the failures in UN peacekeeping, not by European troops, I should hasten to add, are around failures in really basic soldiering. So there's a big piece here around the need for training. And some of those failures are responsible for some of the failures in force protection, which is, and we end up with missions where a huge amount of the resource is spent on the mission protecting itself, but without the right kind of capabilities and training, even that's not particularly effective. And then lastly, I'm not going to go into any detail on this because I'm conscious of the time, but there's a whole sort of broad basket of issues around the links between peacekeeping and humanitarian work, development, human rights, and so on, and how that complicates the delivery of mandates. And the need for us in the Security Council to think really carefully about how much we overload mandates. And I know that even for us collectively as European member states, we think about kind of piling more and more and more onto mandates. But that's not necessarily deliverable. So is there an argument for kind of stripping things back a bit? And then my final comment, just because apart from the question of the P5, the other thing that always gets mentioned in every meeting I go to anywhere now is Brexit. I'm just going to compliment the organisers of this conference on the title of the conference being about European contributions to peacekeeping rather than just about EU contributions to peacekeeping. And I'm just going to leave that there. Thank you.
Great. Perfect. Thank you so much, I think that does a great job of connecting the broader strategic picture, the U.S. and Russia, Brexit, China, with the very more specifics around efficiency of peacekeeping and some of the reforms. And so I'll just leave it at that. In the interest of time, we'll move straight to Richard. Richard, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Adam. I can be brief, I think, because firstly, the three previous speakers have said almost everything I was going to say. And secondly, Adam, your comments at the beginning of the conference made me very aware of the fleeting nature of existence and fast passage of time, because as you looked over the history of the Vienna Seminar, I realized that I was here for the 36th Vienna Seminar in 2006. And it was such a different time to be talking about peacekeeping. The beginning of 2006, before the Israeli-Hezbollah war, was a moment where Europeans felt broadly positive about UN peace operations, but Europeans were not playing a very significant role in peacekeeping. And I think that for most of us then, peacekeeping was essentially a humanitarian business. It was something that we did in countries that didn't really matter to us, like Liberia or possibly Darfur. And the discussion of peacekeeping as a result in Europe was quite detached, because there wasn't really a sense that we had a very strong stake in what the UN was doing a decade ago. And listening to the comments now, it is absolutely obvious that this has changed, that as Europeans, we are highly aware of the ring of fire on Europe's southern and eastern borders, and we very rightly ask, what can the UN do for us, and what can we do through the UN to try and stabilize our extremely volatile peripheries. I just want to break down the ring of fire, as it were, and look at three different regions on our borders where we see instability and where the UN has some role to play. These regions are to the south, to the southeast, and to the east. In the south, we have the troubled Sahel, and that's what we've largely been talking about in this panel so far. We have the problems of uncontrolled people flow, of terrorism and weak states in Libya, in Mali, and in the surrounding neighborhood. To the southeast, we have an even worse situation, and probably a deteriorating situation, in the Middle East, with the vicious conflicts in Syria and Yemen, and the continuing instability in Gaza. And then to the east, we have a series of frozen conflicts, but we also have a very, very live conflict in Ukraine, a conflict that has really challenged some of our assumptions about the permanence of European security and European borders. Now, the UN, and to some extent UN peacekeeping, has a role to play to the south, to the southeast, and to the east. I'm not going to say very much more about what the UN is doing in the south, because we've covered that very intensively so far. My guess is that Europe and its African friends will continue to take a sticking plaster approach to security in the Sahel. We will continue to respond to new problems in that region by creating ad hoc missions, sometimes UN missions, more often regional operations with UN support, to try and keep problems like the rise of Boko Haram under control. I completely agree with Cohen that our goal should be to get some sort of strategic framework for the different missions in the region to increase coherence and to increase the efficiency of those operations. But we don't need to say very much more about the South, because we've covered it well. In the Southeast, or the Middle East, we face two specific challenges concerning the UN. The first is what we do with the existing UN missions, UNSO, UNDOF, and UNIFIL, and what their role will be in a highly volatile region going forward. And then there is the question of what we might be able to do through the UN in countries where we do not currently have missions, such as Syria or Yemen, in the best case scenario that they gradually stumble towards peace. Looking at the existing missions, it's clear that in the last few years, UNTSO, UNDOF and UNIFIL have had to go through a significant period of adaptation and improvisation. UNTSO having to spin off military observers, for example, for Syria in 2012, UNDOF going through probably the worst period of its entire existence, facing terrorist attacks on the Golan Heights, having troops kidnapped, having Irish forces go into action to protect those troops. I think perhaps we have been lucky so far that UNIFIL has not faced a similar level of challenge to UNDOF. My guess is that going forward, all these missions are going to continue to face violent challenges and political instability. The current situation in the Middle East ends in one of two ways. There will either be a full-scale war between Israel and Iran, or there will be a very, very tenuous and fragile peace between Israel and Iran. And who is going to be stuck in either of those situations between the Israelis and Hezbollah and the Iranian proxies in Syria? The UN. UNIFIL is going to be on the front line, it is on the front line of one of the most dangerous geopolitical tectonic plates there is. And I think we're going to have to look at how we can adapt UNIFIL, adapt UNDOF to continue to contribute to stability in the Middle East that will be more rather than less dangerous in the years ahead. There's also been talk, as you know, in the Security Council of putting UN peacekeepers or a protection force in Gaza. That, I think, is unlikely for the foreseeable future, but we should never rule that out as a possible future operation. In the meantime, we have to hope, pray, and ask Mr. Putin to try and end the conflict in Syria. If the Syrian war does come to an end, I no longer think that it is likely that we will have blue helmet peacekeepers on the ground. That was something we were talking about quite a lot in 2011, 2012, 2013. It's no longer a realistic prospect. The UN will have, I think, a significant role in the reconstruction of Syria if and when it is possible to come to a political settlement. But that role will be largely about aid, largely about humanitarian assistance and refugee return. I think we'll probably see some form of special political mission set up in those circumstances to coordinate the UN's role, but it won't have a significant military component. There has been talk, too, of putting peacekeepers into Yemen. I find that also inconceivable at the present time. And again, I think that the UN's role is largely going to be about civilian relief in the Yemeni case. These are going to be terribly difficult political and operational challenges for the UN, for the Secretary General, and for the Security Council. European countries are going to have to pump money, frankly, into the UN to support Syria and Yemen in a post-conflict scenario, but it won't involve blue helmets. By contrast, the place where I think we might see blue helmets, or at least a multinational force under UN authorization within the next couple of years, is eastern Ukraine. And this is something that I've written about, actually not for ECFR, but for the Hudson Institute in DC. Perhaps Mr. Putin will say something here about eastern Ukraine, but most of you will remember that back in September he floated the possibility of a UN peacekeeping force in the Donbass. Clearly there's going to be nothing in Crimea. And the US and Russia, to some extent involving Germany, France and others, have continued to discuss, largely through Track 2 mechanisms, the possibility of putting peacekeepers in the Donbass to end that conflict. Now, I do not stay awake at night waiting with excitement for that peacekeeping operation to deploy. The current geopolitical circumstances in the Security Council mean that getting a deal and getting a sufficient level of trust between Russia and the West over the Donbass is very unlikely to eventuate in the immediate future. But I do think that on the strategic horizon, we can still imagine scenarios in which, as part of a broader process of de-escalation between Russia and the West, there will be a demand for peacekeepers in the Donbass to facilitate local elections, as stipulated under previous peace agreements, to reassure Kiev, and to protect civilians in what would be a pretty nasty post-war environment. Now, when we start thinking about a peacekeeping force, whether it's UN-commanded or a multinational force in the Donbass, we find ourselves going back to a sort of peacekeeping that predates the current generation of operations. I think that we would be imagining a force that looked more like that which the UN deployed in eastern Slavonia back in the 90s, for those of you who followed that story. We would be looking for a force that would require a strong Central European component, and a strong Central European component, the sound system is trying to edit me out, because what I'm going to say is we will need a strong Central European component centering on the good old neutrals. You will need Swedes, you will need Finns, and yes, you will need Austrians at the core of any peace operation in Ukraine, providing an umbrella for other troop contributors, potentially including some NATO members, some CSTO members, Latin Americans and others. But nonetheless, it's fairly clear that any operation in that region would have to rely on some of the countries that were at the core of peacekeeping in the Cold War era. It would be a return to a sort of Cold War peacekeeping. That would be an enormous challenge, I think, in terms of force generation and in terms of the politics of putting your troops so close to the Russian border, but it may be a necessary part of the process of de-escalation that we would like to see with the Russians. All in all, therefore, it seems to me that the UN has a long-term significance to European security in the southeast, and potentially to our east, but it will be a very, very different contribution in each region. For now, the goal, the focus is to the south and Mali, but give us a few years, or maybe if we come back for the 60th, or perhaps hopefully the 50th Vienna Seminar, we'll be talking about a very different form of UN engagement and European role in UN peacekeeping, not so far away from here.
Great, thank you, Richard. You know, it's this is being recorded, so it's dangerous to give predictions because we can hold you to them.
It's better to be interesting than to be right.
No, well, thank you for that really insightful breakdown of the three regions and potentials for UN contributions. It's interesting to me the kind of peacekeeping that you would foresee in eastern Ukraine. When we actually brainstormed with the Defense Ministry about this year's Vienna Seminar, we talked about the need to get back to basics, and it seems that is in part what you're describing there. We have about 30 minutes for a Q&A, so if anybody has questions, comments for this insightful panel, the floor is open. There's a lot on the table to talk about. One thing that I would like to pose to our speakers, and in particular those to my right, is there does seem to be, to me, this contradiction, or really a tension between, there seems to be an obvious, when we talk about European re-engagement and peacekeeping, there seems to be an obvious turn towards it is necessary for our collective interest. As Cohen said, Mali, it's not about goodwill, it's about actually our collective interest. But at the same time, there is a turn towards a more strategic stance about national defense. Now, these things theoretically are compatible, but when you get down to debates about investment, financing and such, they're in contradiction. How do you make that case for the need for more investment in a collective interest perspective?
Maybe I try expanding on what I was saying on what has happened at the EU level. Precisely the reason why the fact that things are happening on the capabilities front is a good thing is exactly because that is where the contradiction lies very much. And so the fact that you have a willingness to move on these issues where there's a lot of vested interest, including economic, industrial, domestic politic issues, etc., is something important. The fact that the European Commission is willing to put some money to incentivize national policies to actually play a more cooperative game on a number of issues is something that is really important. But it's hard to see how you can move very fast, very far on this level if you are not moving on the more operational level and on the policy level. And that's why I mentioned this issue of solidarity. That I think is maybe not explicit enough and would need to be discussed. But for instance, one of the reasons why the French European Intervention Initiative is controversial is precisely because there's a lot of suspicion that the French are doing it again, that they are pushing their national interest or their national vision they are trying to impose that onto European defense, and they are doing it with the usual partners. And the fact that it's happening outside of the EU framework, the fact that there's a willingness to have the UK on board because it's about Europeans and not about the EU just, is very much seen as a kind of usual French way to do things. And that is why it's interesting that among the 10 member states that should be part of this European Intervention Initiative, which is still to be formalized, hopefully end of this month, it's important that you see that the French are making a big deal, that Estonia is meant to be part of it, and the Estonians are making a big deal out of it too. And part of the underlying basis for that is precisely that Estonia is willing to contribute, even if it's limited contribution in terms of number, to what is happening in the Sahel, and the French are contributing to what NATO is doing through Eastern Forward Presence. And there is a level of something that is maybe still very transactional in terms of quid pro quo. We have interests in the East and in the South, or on territorial defense and on stability projection, but we find a way to compromise and to do both, because we know that our interests at the end are complementary, or should be complementary rather than opposed. And so the way that these things are happening, I feel are steps in the right direction that wasn't there in previous instances where there was this effort to move forward on European defense, I would say.
If I just can add, from a more operational sense, you've got this overall cooperation which has been gaining momentum between the UN and the EU, the UN and the AU. So you've got all these platforms, and now basically you have a multiplier. Yes, you have your national defense concerns, but also national defense relies in the end on partnerships. You have to have partnerships in this world. And so in that sense, you have with the UN Peacekeeping Operation a platform where you can invest and others invest, and that can make a difference. But it's also important to keep an eye on the fact that, well, people are investing in different parts of an operation, and as Richard said, that has to be coordinated. You've got other international forces. The UK has made a contribution to that. That's very important also for the security and safety of Mali. And so it's creating a common platform that can help regional stability, but that also can take care of your national security concerns. So it can be there can be gains both ways. Any further questions from the floor?
There's a Rory Keane there.
Thank you very much, Rory Keane from the United Nations, based in Brussels, working on the partnership between UN peacekeeping and European Union and NATO. Two questions for this panel, and thank you for the very interesting, insightful presentations. One in terms of the strategic context, and one new development we see in the strategic context is working trilaterally, also specifically in terms of the Sahel, working with the G5 Sahel Joint Force. Under UN Security Council Resolution 2391, we see quite an innovative approach whereby the European Union, via the African Peace Facility, is providing financial support to MINUSMA, allowing MINUSMA in turn to provide logistic and other support to the operation of the G5 Sahel Joint Force. And there is still, of course, a financial gap for that work, and we assume that European countries will also step forward to support that. The question I would have for the panel is: does this represent a new trajectory? Is this something we will potentially see more of in the future, working through ad hoc third actors and so on, under a Security Council resolution, and using the United Nations or United Nations operation as a backstopping mechanism? Is there likely to be more of this? And if yes, what are the challenges and opportunities that go with that for the United Nations, and indeed for actors like the European Union that are supporting it? That would be my first question. My second question relates to the point on capabilities, and it's really on whether the European Union and European Union member states can be encouraged as they roll out the European Defence Fund, as they roll out the work on capabilities, to also take into consideration the UN capability needs, so that we have an interoperability when we're thinking about what are the capability shortfalls. Because right now, if we look at a lot of the discussion in terms of the European Defence Fund and capabilities, a lot of it is very, very high tech in terms of air-to-air refueling and so on and so forth. But is there a way also to ensure that we take in UN capability needs into that discussion as it's rolled out? Also, of course, in terms of cooperation also with the PCRS, etc. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you.
So just on Rory's questions, I think on the second point, I think that would be very much welcome. That basically focusing on the UN's capacity need. And there, I'd like to point to the fact that within the follow-up of the Santos Cruz report, which we addressed, that we're looking at mobile training teams, which basically do in-theater training of troops that are contributed to MINUSMA. We also have we already have two American mentoring teams that are helping with on that front. I would say, however, that nothing can replace pre-deployment training, and that they're basically the coalition of those who are involved in this, and there's a lot of training already going on by the EU, ACOTA training, etc., to bring more coherence into that system so that troops come to the theater prepared is incredibly important. But I do think this would be a very important contribution to making that work. We already are doing a lot of counter-IED and other training with UNMAS and other partners. And to make this part of it would put it on a different scale. On the first question, we feel we very much welcome the cooperation with the EU on supporting the G5 force. You're asking, could this be an example for other cases? My answer would be yes, if it's a success. So we have to continue to make it a success. And that's why we need those financial contributions. The Secretary General has written to the Council on this. It's very important that the region take ownership. It's very important also as an example that we managed to have a human rights framework be part of it, which is embraced by the G5 countries, embraced by the force. Incredibly important, because basically This is about difficult operations, and if we can make those operations be successful, it has to be basically a protection of civilian focus and human rights focus has to be part of that. Thank you.
Thanks. I think on the second question about the capabilities, certainly the answer in London would be yes, and it's an increasing part of the Ministry of Defence planning processes in London to think about how we can use the capabilities that we have, which frankly we're thinking, of course, in terms of fairly niche capabilities to support the UN. And that's quite a complicated process because we do have limited resources available, and so what you deploy to where to do what and how you move those resources around the globe is a really complicated process. But the UN now features much more largely in that than it did a few years ago, and partly that is a result of the establishment of the joint unit that I mentioned when I spoke before, in terms of sort of pulling together the defence aspects with the kind of foreign policy and wider aspects. On the question about G5 Sahel, and I think there's a slightly unfortunate sense in using the term ad hoc to describe these sorts of things, because that maybe gives a sense that they're unplanned or unstrategic or just sort of, it's ad hoc, we just threw it together. I think that actually going forward, then the idea of operating in variable geometries, in different kinds of partnerships, is actually the way that we're going to find ourselves working, not just on peacekeeping, but in the wider UN system. And when I say partnerships, I mean member states, I mean external actors, and so on. Now, the disadvantage of that is that it's really complicated. And I think, frankly, for member states, for the UN itself, we kind of operate best when we're in sort of nice, neat formations that we're used to working in, that endure over some period of time. And if we're constantly creating new coalitions, new geometries, new ways of working,
Let's cut out. Yeah, I mean, I think, Rory, what we're seeing in the Sahel is actually, in a sense, a sequel and a repeat of what we saw in Somalia 6 or 7 years ago, where no one wanted to run a straightforward blue helmet operation. And so we ended up stacking AU on UN, 2 different UN missions, the EU boats off the coast, Western special forces popping around killing people. That is the future of stabilization and peace operations. There are only going to be a few cases, I think, where you have the UN go in as a single big conglomerate. From now on, everything is going, I think, to be based on plug-and-play arrangements with different organizations bringing their comparative advantages to the table. And I think I'm not nice about the UN very often, but actually one of the nice things I have seen in the UN over the last 5 years or so is the organization start to adapt to this much more flexible environment. And I think that the UN continues to have a huge amount of value as a center for expertise on planning, on other dimensions of peace operations, logistics, administration. Yes, it's inefficient, but actually it's still better than most of the alternatives. And I think that we see our colleagues at the UN taking advantage of that, and I hope that we're moving towards a more flexible UN that is able to work in lots of different combinations in lots of different places. Even in Ukraine, if we had a UN peacekeeping force in Ukraine, it would be alongside the OSCE, the EU and NATO are already in Ukraine. The future is messy, and we should be okay with that.
Maybe two quick words. There is definitely a trend in regionalization, and Europeans have been pioneers in wanting to have their own regional organization being in charge of the region's security. So we should clearly understand that it's a very legitimate ambition from others to move in that direction. Still, in addition to what Richard just said, and I agree with what Richard just said, is that Mali and Central African Republic are good recent examples of the fact that we had African forces and we needed to transition to UN forces for a number of reasons, on top of what Richard just mentioned, the fact that the African missions were military forces, and we needed the kind of political operation with a military component and with a police component that the UN can provide, and that the African security architecture, the sub-regional organizations and the regional organizations were not able to provide. So that's an important point that we need to still keep in mind. On the capability needs, I'm with you, but I don't see that happening so much, if only because the reason why we have PESCO and we have EDF is precisely to work on those kind of higher tech issues for a number of good operational and bad purely economic or industrial reasons. But the nice thing is that this shouldn't be all of the story. There is cooperation outside of the EDF. There is cooperation outside of PESCO. People who don't like PESCO think it's not ambitious enough, say that most of the projects under PESCO could have taken place without PESCO, and that's not totally untrue. And so you don't need to have EDF or PESCO to do the kind of taking on board the UN needs in terms of capabilities and get Europeans moving on that. On the contrary, you can probably do it on the side and still be more effective than we are for the moment. Or that, at least that's how I would see it.
Yes, sir, Secretary.
Thank you. Joe Coops from the University of Brussels. Thanks so much to all panelists on this great debate so far on the strategic context. Kind of following up on the African side of things, one thing I was surprised not to hear is in the wider troop contribution context. We have now for 2 years for the first time that 2 of the top 5 contributing countries are in fact African countries, so Ethiopia and Rwanda. How does that change the nature of peacekeeping, or will change the nature of peacekeeping in the future? Will it matter for the discussions that come from the TCC side? And how would the Europeans respond to it? Will there be a proactive approach essentially in engaging more the kind of, in inverted commas, for search for a better word, the African dimension essentially in the regular contributions and the debates that are going to ensue? Thanks.
Thank you. That question, but actually there's one more question, and then we can come back to the panel for responses and final words. Oliver.
It's not so much a question, just a very, very brief comment, which I can't resist making, which is that inefficient doesn't mean expensive. It's really a response to some of Corinne's comments, but also Richard's comments. While we may be quite inefficient, for example, in hiring new civilian staff, which takes us far too long, that actually saves member states money. And we are far, far cheaper, as has been shown by countless studies, including the US Government Accountability Office, than any comparable NATO, EU, US, UK operation that could be launched in a similar kind of set of circumstances. And the cost per peacekeeper, which is a pretty good measure of efficiency and effectiveness, in some respects has been declining significantly over the last few years. There's much more we can do to become more efficient and effective, clearly, and we are working on that, as has been mentioned a number of times, but I don't want to have the impression left that our inefficiencies necessarily make us very expensive, because they don't. Thanks.
Yes, sure. Right.
Thanks, Vanna. Thanks for the presentations. I just wanted to ask, from your viewpoints, what more the UN can do to facilitate UN contributions, encourage them with your governments, with your public, with your militaries. What more can the UN do to get these contributions in the future, given the kind of strategic context and the challenges that you've outlined? Thanks.
questions, comments to bring us to a close. And Cohen, it's good because you started out that you were going to be controversial and then no one actually took the bait, but we finally got a bit there. So maybe we could go in reverse order and responses and final word. So Richard, do you want to respond?
On the African issue, I mean, yes, now nearly 50%, it's not quite 50%, of all uniformed personnel in UN peace operations are African. And that's something we should pause and celebrate, because if you go back 20 years, the general projection was that African nations could collectively deploy about 10,000 peacekeepers in total. And the current figure, if you lump together UN, AU and other operations, must be 60,000 plus. And that's that reflects African political commitment, it reflects growing African defense spending, but it also reflects a huge amount of work through the EU-AU relationship, through US support, and through a lot of other donor relations. It's a real strategic success that there are now so many African peacekeepers largely patrolling their own continent. And I think going forward, we should expect to see those numbers rise. I think we will see more cases like Mali, where the bulk of infantry come from within the continent or within the sub-region. I think we will see a concomitant decline, frankly, of South Asian and Latin American contributions to peacekeeping in Africa. UNIFIL and other cases will be different. Peacekeeping in Africa is becoming more African, and the challenge before European countries is to work out how to plug in to and work with that tendency and to continue to support that tendency, because I think that is the overall strategic arc that we are seeing, and it's a strategic arc which Secretary General Guterres in particular has given his support to. I didn't accuse you of being expensive, Oliver. I did accuse you of being inefficient, but I've never been that excited by efficiency. We deployed an amazingly efficient NATO force in Afghanistan. That went really well. We efficiently invaded Iraq. Boom. Yeah, look, all interventions are inherently inefficient. Stabilization is an inefficient business. The bean counters can always criticize us for running messy, open-ended operations, but welcome to the business. And I actually think, as I say, that the UN is probably more efficient than a lot of the alternatives. Adam, what can we do to increase European interest in these peace operations, or what can the UN do? I mean, my answer to that is twofold and indirect. I mean, firstly, what drives contributions is crises. It's not public relations campaigns. No one has ever done anything because DPI motivated them to do it. What will increase the number of European peacekeepers? An operation in Ukraine, just as the 2006 crisis massively pushed up the number of peacekeepers in European peacekeepers in the Middle East. It's unfortunate, I think, that the current US administration is not pushing Europeans to deploy more troops in blue helmets, as the previous administration did, as you worked on. I hope that European countries and like-minded countries like Canada will try and keep alive the fourth generation process which the Obama administration started. The last note is, I think there's a much more general problem of European isolationism that is not solely focused on peacekeeping at all. We're seeing publics turning against migrants, we're seeing publics turning against development aid, and that general drift is something that all politicians have to fight, because if there is an overall decline in cosmopolitanism in Europe, which there is, that will have a knock-on effect to all aspects of the UN's work.
And is it working now?
No, I'm not sure.
Thank you. So On the question about the increasing contributions from African countries, I think two key things that it changes. One is the issue around caveats from TCCs, and we have generally seen, and I'm talking in very general terms here, that some of the African TCCs are much more prepared to engage in more kinetic peacekeeping, and some of the more traditional TCCs, particularly those from South Asia, have tended to be much more cautious in their approach and much more risk averse. So I think that's a shift. I think it will also, in time, have an impact on the voice of the A3, the 3 African member states in the Security Council, because obviously they feel more invested in what's going on, and they feel that they should have a bigger say. So that's important. On Oliver's comment, of course, you know I'm a huge fan of UN peacekeeping, and I just want it to be better. And of course, it's one of those things when there are sort of spectacular examples of inefficiencies, even when they're tiny, they just make me kind of sigh, because it really doesn't help us when we're trying to bring people on board with UN peacekeeping. In terms of what the UN can do to facilitate contributions, I guess two practical things. One of the things that's worked so far has been the series of conferences with pledging, and the idea of a sort of pay-to-play element to those conferences, that member states have to stump up some kind of pledge in order to be invited, in order to be included. And my second practical point would be about smart pledging, which is where TCCs get together and provide combined pledges. And our example of that is our Level 2 field hospital in South Sudan, where we are passing that on to the Vietnamese. And the UK is providing the equipment, the Vietnamese are taking over the hospital, the Australians are providing the airlift to get the stuff from Vietnam to South Sudan. So a kind of joint effort where you bring together different capabilities from different TCCs.
On cooperating with African TCCs, last time I discussed this with people at the French MOD, they did mention that clearly, and I don't think that the French are so at ease with the countries who are there, and so they want to see more and others. And they work a lot with Senegal, and they try to push for Côte d'Ivoire to play in that league. And they also do it out of a sense that it's a good way to help build and fund the military in these countries, to get those troops, African troops, in UN peacekeeping operation. And surely, just to complement what Richard was saying on that, I think on top of it, the fact that the Chinese and now the Russians in Central African Republic in particular are active in working with these African troop contributing countries, actually taking the UN context as a door to broader military cooperation is something that should be of interest to Europeans in general. On facilitating European contributions, of course, it's about crisis first and foremost, and which crisis in particular. So you can't really, you shouldn't be creating crises that fit with European interests just for the sake of having European contributions. The problem is, how do you manage to be ready when those crises happen? Because I agree with what Richard was saying, that there's a number of reasons that don't have so much to do with the UN, or at least with UN peacekeeping and the way it is organized for European countries to contribute. The problem is actually not so much that more European countries contribute, because a big number, in terms of number of countries in the European continent, you have a big number of countries who are already contributing. It's just that what they contribute is not so much. And so the question is more than they stay and increase their contribution. And you can see in a number of European military, the kind of fatigue, the need for stamina and maybe rotation is one of the answers to that. But there is clearly this idea that you are there out of a political context, and if the political context fades away, you're wondering why you are there, or you try to cut into your numbers. And so if you want to have people stay rather than attract them to come, you do need to solve the pressing issues that they see when they are deployed. That is for sure. You need to look at why it is the case that European countries are more at ease with Mali, where there is a French parallel presence, with a number of things that come with it, in spite of Mali being a much more risky terrain than in other operations. It's also about what the UN can offer in terms of security, in terms of medical evacuation, in terms of effectiveness on command and control and ISR, etc. And of course, Europeans too have their parts to do, not to behave as a EU or NATO subgroup within these operations and engage with the broader mission. But the underlying reasons why Europeans' contributions are behaving that way, I think, is what you need to tackle first, I'd say.
So just focusing on the African contribution, Mali is a traditional contributor to UN peacekeeping. The commander of the armed forces, General Keita, is a former peacekeeper. The Minister of Security, General Salif Traore, is a former peacekeeper. The major francophone peacekeeping school is in Bamako. So you could say that Mali paid its insurance and is now benefiting from peacekeeping. I think the fact that there's big African participation is a very good thing. It needs to be supported. It needs to be supported by training, by all the relations we have, and I really applaud the contributions, for instance, by Germany and the US, who have provided mine-protected vehicles for African contingents. Those vehicles save lives, and the accompanying training saves lives. We still have a deficit of something like 100 mine-protected vehicles. We have a deficit of 3 helicopter units, which help with mobility and which also protect people in case of CASEVAC. So in a sense, what I'm worried about in terms of efficiency and so on is, can we deliver for the troops on the ground so that we make the most use of them and so that they can help protect the population. So I think our efforts should be focused on that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. It's been a great start to the day. You know, we framed this whole discussion on of the day, lessons learned in the way forward. I think we've done a good job here, both looking back and moving ahead. My just very general takeaway is that indeed the multilateral engagement in peacekeeping is, of course, in the collective interest of Europe and others. And indeed, while UN peacekeeping is maybe not completely efficient, it is inexpensive, and perhaps that is the one way to actually make the case for more contributions. But it's not just about the UN. Looking forward, as Richard said, the future is messy. It's about partnerships of various kinds, which creates the need for flexibility, presents challenges and opportunities. But I think the rest of the day's discussions will help us think through that in more detail. We've got a coffee break now, and then we'll reconvene at 11:30 for our second session on perspectives on UN participation in UN peacekeeping operations. Thank you all very much.